vegetarian. Let's go a step farther and make the whole family vegan. What are you going to do at church suppers? Are we going to talk behind their backs about their vegan commitment? Now, I live with a husband who is a firm devotee of ham, not just regular baked ham, but country ham. His family roots are in southwestern Kentucky, and country ham and grits with biscuits and black-eyed gravy are at the top of his breakfast favorites. Not that it's as regular an occurrence as it used to be. We have dear neighbors who are vegetarians or who don't eat red meat, and so we adapt. This morning, Paul, in his letter to the Romans, has heard of a problem in that relatively new Christian community. In that gathering in that faraway city were people who'd grown up as Jews. There were also people who once had worshipped a whole range of gods. The former Jews, for the most part, were very selective about the food they ate. You might say they kept kosher. They certainly wouldn't eat food that had been sacrificed to the Roman gods. They might be strictly vegetarians or vegans so as to not unknowingly eat such sacrifices. Others in this new Christian community took another point of view. They believed that since these Roman gods really didn't exist and had no power over their lives, then it was perfectly okay to eat this sacrificed meat that would otherwise go to waste. And so the battle begins. Which group of folks was behaving as true Christians? Who's weak and who's strong? Paul in his letter pulls them both up short. It's not their responsibility to judge each other. Both groups are trying to please the God that they know in Jesus Christ. On this matter, God is their judge. We do not live to ourselves, and we do not die to ourselves. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. Paul says that holding together the community of faith is more important than the type of food eaten. It's God's job to judge us. It's not the responsibility of us humans. Managing judgment in the faith community is followed today by mercy and forgiveness in the Gospel of Matthew. It's a tough story in the extreme that we hear Jesus tell the disciples. This passage is placed in a section of Matthew about community life. Earlier in the same chapter, we have the parable of the shepherd searching for one lost sheep who's gone astray, seeming to value the lost sheep more than the ones who had stayed where they were supposed to be. And then last week, we heard guidance about handling disputes when one member felt that they had been wronged by another member. And then today's story about forgiveness and mercy. The three stories all fit together. This morning, Peter comes forward with a question many of us may have asked ourselves or other people. How many times do I have to forgive someone who has wronged me? As many as 7 times? Asked Peter. And then comes the astronomical number. No, says Jesus, 7 times 7. Or some versions say 70 times 7. Either figure seems out of the question. If we've been wronged repeatedly by a friend or a family member or a business associate or a bully, how can we keep forgiving? And the astronomical numbers keep coming. A king, says Jesus, decides it's time to settle accounts with his slaves and demand payment. What the first slave owes is an impossible figure. In today's money, it would be worth well over $1 billion. That's with a B. Jesus' hearers almost 2,000 years ago would have been astounded to hear this. They would have thought, there's no way this slave could have run up that kind of debt. And if he had, there's no way he could ever repay it. This guy's doomed, and his family too. And then when all seems lost, the king has mercy, and not only cuts back the amount owed, but the king totally wipes out the debt. The debt is forgiven. But this isn't the end, of course. The forgiven slave soon runs into one of his companions who owes him money. The money owed is a mere pittance compared to what has already been forgiven the first slave. Certainly a payment plan could have been worked out. But the slave whose debt has been forgiven has the other slave thrown into prison for lack of payment. And then there's more. The king's other slaves see what's happened and report to the king. The slave who's been forgiven now faces torture and prison. Pretty dire consequences. Now let's not linger at this last part too long, because the real focus of Jesus' response to Peter's question, the real focus is on mercy and forgiveness. But there are consequences to not forgiving. The story is told of a conversation between two prisoners of war after they'd been released. And the first one asked the second, "Have you forgiven your captors yet?" And the second one responded, "I can never forgive them." And the first one then said, "They still hold you in prison, don't they? They still hold you in prison, don't they?" Many of us daily pray what is named the Lord's Prayer. And in the middle of those petitions are these words: "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." Other translations are, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors," or "Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us." They all lead us back to that unforgiving servant. The story is told of a man in 16th century Switzerland who, according to records, was called before a church council and told to pray the Lord's Prayer. He said he didn't know the words. But the real reason that he never prayed the Lord's Prayer was that he knew that if he prayed the prayer, he would have to forgive the merchant who had repeatedly cheated him. And he refused to do that. Jesus' story and the words of the Lord's Prayer lead us to look at our lives daily. What grudges are we hanging on to? Who do we need to forgive? To whom do we owe a debt? Or who have we sinned against? Maybe we have a debt of time that we owe someone. Maybe there are other types of debts to consider. The purpose of forgiveness is not to let the power of the debt hold us captive, as the prisoner of war was held captive by his inability to forgive. We who hang on to the debts we are owed live with our own form of torture and prison. To forgive does not mean that the wrong done to us is forgotten, because some wrongs simply are too painful to forget. Forgiving the other can help to set us free. From now until November 3rd, and probably beyond, there will be many hurtful words,